Iran is currently facing something more serious than just a wave of protests in various cities that were initially triggered by food prices, inflation, and the collapse of the currency that has now turned into a direct threat to the state's authority. The economic crisis that is squeezing the daily lives of Iranians has opened major cracks in the foundations of the regime's power, which has long been maintained through control and repression. When the demand for a decent life turns into a rejection of authorities who are deemed to have failed to protect their people, it means that the country is no longer facing an economic problem, but rather a crisis of power. But the question is, to what extent will this crisis push Iran towards perhaps more radical political change? Could another revolution occur in Iran after decades? To understand more, watch this video. Iran is a country with unique political conditions that combine elements of a republic with absolute theocratic power, where the highest power does not culminate in the sovereignty of the people, but rather in the principle of guardianship of Islamic legal experts. In this system, the supreme leader holds absolute power that transcends all state institutions, including the legislative, executive, and judiciary. Under such conditions, state institutions were designed in such a way that these cleric figures had full control through key institutions, especially the Guardian Council, half of whose members were appointed directly by the supreme leader. This council then acts as a very strict ideological filter. They have the constitutional authority to veto any law deemed inconsistent with Islamic law. And crucially, they have the right to disqualify political candidates in general elections. As a result, despite the existence of electoral mechanisms, civil political space is very limited because only individuals and groups whose loyalty to the theocratic system has been tested are allowed to participate. The political power of the ruling regime in Iran has in fact given the supreme leader an unchallenged mandate in determining the direction of national policy, both domestically and internationally. Although the president and members of parliament are elected through a voting process, the sovereignty of voters is limited by the candidate screening process carried out by the Guardian Council. This screening process systematically excludes figures from the moderate spectrum, reformists, or anyone who proposes structural changes that could threaten to shake power. By limiting choices to only circles of regime loyalists, electoral politics in Iran often loses its democratic substance and becomes merely an instrument of symbolic support to show the international world that the regime still has popular support. In fact, the political choices available are very limited and have been arranged long in advance. Meanwhile, within Iran's security establishment, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, has emerged as a parallel force whose role extends far beyond the ordinary military functions of a state. The IRGC is not just an armed force tasked with guarding the borders, but also serves as an ideological and economic pillar responsible directly to the supreme leader, not to the Ministry of Defense or the civil government. This privileged position positions the IRGC as a key tool in maintaining regime stability and implementing the state's ideological priorities both domestically, through strict surveillance of the opposition, and abroad, through asymmetric operations. But because the IRGC is not under the control of the president, it often operates independently of formal foreign policy, making it an unrivaled force within Iran's power structure. This rigid Iranian political concept exerts structural pressures that ultimately shackle the Iranian economy. It's worth noting that the country's economy is heavily dependent on the oil and gas sector, which historically contributed more than half of the national income. Although the government often touts promises of economic diversification to break away from dependence on natural resources, dependence on oil and gas is already deep. This vulnerability is the main weak point when Iran faces global sanctions, especially those imposed by the United States and the European Union. These sanctions, which target the energy sector and access to the international financial system, have ultimately not only cut off the country's revenue streams, but also crippled the national financial structure, leaving Iran isolated from global markets and making it difficult to import the technology and capital needed for industrial modernization. But more than just the matter of commodities or trade goods, the conflict between the regime's interests and the civilian economic sector is exacerbated by the IRGC's dominance in the productive sectors. Through various foundations and affiliated companies, the IRGC controls strategic industries ranging from construction and energy to telecommunications and transportation. This dominance creates an economic ecosystem that is not transparent and often operates outside of healthy and fair market mechanisms. Monopoly by the military elite, stifling private growth, thus encouraging widespread corruption and closing economic opportunities for ordinary citizens. As a result, a shadow economic network emerged involving loan sharking and oil smuggling to evade sanctions, further concentrating wealth in the hands of a small elite with political and military power. Meanwhile, the people bear the economic burden. The combination of a bold and somewhat fraught foreign policy, including a nuclear program deemed provocative by the West and militaristic economic management, has triggered increasingly stifling international sanctions. These sanctions have cut off Iran's access to the global banking system, restricted oil sales, and frozen the country's assets abroad. The impact is felt very clearly on a macro and micro level. Starting from the value of the rial currency, which continues to plummet, inflation has soared to levels that destroy purchasing power, and the price of basic necessities has become unaffordable for the majority of the population. This mounting imbalance ultimately creates a deep sense of injustice, limited economic opportunities, and the collective loss of hope. This is what ultimately became the fuel for the massive protest movement that began in late December 2025 and continues to this day, where society begins to openly challenge the power structures that are considered the main source of the multidimensional crisis. Iran is now suffering from a currency crisis and sharp inflation. The crisis indirectly exposed how fundamentally fragile Iran's economic structure is. By the end of December 2025, the value of the Iranian rial had fallen to an unprecedented low, with the free market exchange rate reaching a dramatic range of around 1.38 to 1.45 million rials per US dollar. In fact, as of January 11, 2026, the figure has plummeted further, with the exchange rate of 1 rial equal to 0.0010 US dollars. The Iranian currency has lost approximately 20,000 times its value over 4 decades. This extraordinary decline in value is not just a statistical figure, but a systemic disaster that has affected the wheels of the Iranian economy. With the current tense situation, the price of imported goods is becoming increasingly unaffordable for the general public. Meanwhile, normal trading activities, such as those in traditional markets or bazaars, have come to a complete halt because traders are experiencing operational paralysis. They have difficulty determining a stable selling price amidst the wild fluctuations in currency values every hour. The response to this major shock even led to the resignation of the governor of the Central Bank of Iran, a desperate move that shows the impasse and immense pressure on the monetary policy management of a country that has lost control of its financial instruments. The currency crisis did not occur suddenly. This is directly related to the very high inflation rate, which is increasingly destroying the purchasing power of lower middle-class citizens to a worrying level. According to official data, which often does not reflect the reality on the ground, which is usually worse, annual inflation in Iran has reached 42%, with staple food prices soaring by around 72% in the past year. The brutal spike in food prices far exceeded people's incomes, which did not experience any increase, thus ultimately creating a new poverty gap. Basic necessities like bread, fruit, cooking oil, and basic medicines are becoming increasingly difficult for low and middle-income families to afford, forcing people to resort to extreme frugality. For many families, these price increases are no longer a lifestyle choice, but an existential choice between buying food or covering other crucial costs such as transportation and children's education, especially after state subsidies that once functioned as a social safety net are now largely eliminated or strictly limited due to budget deficits. This crisis also reflects a profound disconnect between urgent domestic needs and the regime's ideologically driven strategic policy priorities. For decades, Iran's state budget has been heavily directed towards maintaining its large military capacity, financing regional allies in geopolitical confrontations, and maintaining the IRGC's extensive operations and proxy networks abroad. These foreign commitments drain enormous fiscal resources and drastically reduce the space for public investment in aging civilian economic infrastructure. As international sanctions further restrict Iran's access to the global oil market, its primary source of foreign exchange, the pressure has reached a crisis point as Iran loses significant export revenues, leaving the government in a difficult position to stabilize its currency or fund urgent social and economic development programs for its own people. The impact of these policies focused on military resilience and geopolitical strategy is further exacerbated by an uncompetitive economic structure and the absolute dominance of military-linked entities in almost every productive sector. Most major infrastructure projects, international trade, and strategic industries are now controlled by companies affiliated with state foundations that have privileges, including access to subsidized currency rates that are not publicly available. This dominance effectively erodes the room for small and medium-sized businesses that should be more dynamic growth engines when the formal market shrinks and small entrepreneurs are unable to compete with the skyrocketing import costs caused by black market exchange rates. The informal economic space is thriving as a form of survival. However, this shadow economy operates without social security, legal protection, or job stability, which ultimately weakens the national economic base as a whole. The major protests that have rocked Iran since late December 2025 did not emerge out of thin air. Rather, they stem from economic hardship that has reached its breaking point. It all began when merchants in Tehran's Grand Bazaar began a trade strike. They were forced to close their shops because the rial's plummeting value prevented them from pricing their goods. This action quickly sparked solidarity from workers, students, and ordinary citizens in major cities. Issues such as skyrocketing staple food prices and the increasingly unreasonable cost of living were the main catalysts that caused this wave of protests to spread rapidly to hundreds of cities across Iran's 31 provinces. Although initially sparked by rising bread prices and inflation, the movement quickly took on a different form. People began to realize that their economic problems would not be resolved without changes to the way the country was run. As a result, the focus of the protests drastically shifted. The masses were no longer simply demanding lower prices, but were also attacking the highest power structures in various places. Demonstrators began to loudly protest against government rule and symbols of theocratic power, including chanting slogans directly targeting Supreme Leader Ayatollahalikhamenei. This shift demonstrated that the people no longer believed in promises of reforms from within the system, but instead desired more fundamental changes to the political structure. To quell the protests, the Iranian government took the extreme step of cutting off almost all internet access throughout the country on January 8, 2026. This move created an internet blackout, or a complete blackout of information. With the internet cut off to the lowest level, protesters lost the ability to coordinate with each other in real time. Furthermore, this blackout served as a digital curtain, preventing photos and videos of the violence on the ground from being spread abroad. For the international community and Iranian cultural figures abroad, this measure was seen as a deliberate tool of repression to allow the regime to act freely without international scrutiny. The government's response to its own people became increasingly harsh and merciless. Security forces reportedly used live ammunition to disperse the crowds, resulting in a large number of casualties. According to human rights groups, hundreds to thousands of people have been killed and more than 10,000 detained without due process. Activists and organizers of the demonstrations were hunted down and arrested en masse.
To justify this violence, the government employed a long-standing strategy, accusing the demonstrators of being agents of foreign powers seeking to destabilize Iran. This narrative was used as a legal framework to justify physical violence and mass detentions of its own citizens.
The term revolutionary threshold in the current Iranian context is not simply a way to describe the ongoing street demonstrations, but rather to highlight the fact that the regime, which has been in power for decades, is beginning to lose support from key groups that have supported it, from merchants and workers to traditional political supporters. Protests that initially stemmed from basic needs have now turned into a larger narrative that has Iranians questioning the suitability of their government to continue leading the country when it can no longer provide a sense of security in a future. Their demonstrations are no longer just ordinary protests, but rather a serious test for the fragile relationship that exists between the country and its people. One of the most visible signs of this crisis was when traders and the small middle class began to speak out and even take to the streets. In Iran's historical records, this group was once a pillar of support for the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution. However, now that trade has stopped, businesses have been forced to close, and the economy has stalled. They have begun to openly reject government power. The loss of support from groups that previously tended to avoid interfering in political affairs demonstrates that anger has spread across society, from students to manual workers in many cities. They are no longer a group of people who act for their own interests, but instead carry a single voice of anger that crosses economic background and age. Iranian society is also supported by many parties to fight against its own government. This is because the crisis of confidence in Iran is not only occurring domestically, but also in the eyes of the international community. World leaders, international organizations, and global figures are now starting to change the way they view Iran. The German chancellor even made a strong statement, saying that the current regime might be in its final days. This sentence seems to be a strong signal that the world has seen that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's regime is on the brink of collapse. This can already be seen with the additional sanctions of evacuating foreign diplomats from Tehran, and harsh criticism from the UN regarding the violence of the authorities, which has further destroyed international support for Iran. Ali Khamenei's regime is thus no longer seen as a powerful player in the world. Instead, it is now seen as a government that has lost its moral compass in dealing with its own people. Political observers have also assessed that the recent protests are very different from economic protests in the past. The wave of demonstrations that have occurred since the end of December has been greatly influenced by the radical spirit of the younger generation and students who are not only demanding economic improvements, but also attacking the symbols of supreme power that have been in power for decades. They directly criticized Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and demanded that the ruling regime give total freedom to those who want to determine the new direction of the Iranian state. The younger generation completely rejects the religious narrative that the government has used to control society. For them, this is a struggle for a completely new and hopefully better future. Previously, Iran was hit by massive demonstrations called Woman Life Freedom in 2022, a demonstration triggered by the death of Mahsa Amini while being detained for allegedly violating dress codes. At that time, the protests were not as widespread as today because they were very focused on social issues, women's rights, and freedom of dress. So even though it was quite a shock to the government, but not on the same scale as now, the current regime of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei should be trembling. Because this time, the protests are much more dangerous for the regime, because this wave of protests is rooted in the problems of the devastated economy that are felt by everyone in Iran without exception. This problem unites all groups of society, making the crisis much deeper and more difficult to extinguish if the government only faces it with armed violence. The anger will not stop, even if there are dozens of deaths. In fact, it is increasingly fiery in shaking power. Iran is clearly at a crossroads right now. The government has only two choices: to carry out reforms and compromise with the people, or to continue using violence to impose power and get closer to facing a revolution carried out by its people.
But so far, because the government continues to close communication channels and hit demonstrators with violence, the people feel there is no longer any way to dialogue. This crisis may soon determine whether Iran will remain a theocracy or shift completely in a direction unthinkable since the 1979 revolution.
The crisis unfolding in Iran today has very serious and multi-layered domestic consequences. Domestically, the pressing economic pressures and political tensions have the potential to deepen internal divisions, not only between the people and the government, but also among the ruling elites themselves, who are starting to have different opinions on how to handle the country's crisis, which will most likely be responded to with very strict emergency policies, such as the deployment of security forces in every corner of the city, restrictions on the movement of citizens, to the use of harsher violence in order to maintain the impression that the country is still stable. But these crude measures are actually very risky. Instead of calming the situation, violence will actually accelerate the loss of public trust, because it will further deepen the gap between the rulers who want to survive and the people who are suffering. Iran's own history has proven that stability built solely on fear and violence usually does not last long. This step only postpones a big problem that could explode again at any time. Beyond its borders, instability in Iran poses significant risks to the international community. As a key actor in the Middle East with a vast network of allies and proxy groups, a controversial nuclear program, and extremely strained relations with the United States and Israel, any crisis within Iran could spark a firestorm abroad. There is a dangerous tendency for regimes under pressure from protests at home to try to distract their people by taking aggressive action abroad or using war rhetoric against foreign enemies. This greatly increases the risk of open conflict or major war in the region. In the worst-case scenario, chaos inside Iran could drag major powers into a direct confrontation that would be difficult to stop. The impact of this crisis does not stop at security issues alone, but also spreads to the global economy, especially the energy sector. Iran has one of the world's largest oil and gas reserves, so any disruption to its stability would immediately shake global energy markets. One of the most vulnerable points is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage that is the main entry and exit point for global oil distribution. If tensions in Iran escalate and this route is disrupted, global oil prices will immediately spike. This uncertainty creates a rise in the price of goods or inflation globally, which will ultimately increase the burden on other countries whose economies are also weak. In other words, what happens in Tehran or any other city actually has a direct impact on the prices of fuel and basic necessities around the world. Amidst all these risks, a major question arises as to whether Iran is truly headed for a complete change of government, or whether it will simply enter a new phase in which the government becomes more ruthless than before. The Islamic Republic of Iran has long been known for its adeptness at surviving by adapting through violence, such as changing its policies without even touching its core power structures. But this crisis feels different. The current economic failure is affecting almost everyone, from the lower to the middle class, and this weakens the ideology that the regime has always been proud of. When a country is no longer able to provide basic necessities, a sense of security, or hope for the future for its young people, then their ability to maintain the old state or status quo will be highly questionable.